They have ruled the seas for half a century and given one Navy dominance on all the world's oceans. They are the carriers. Their business is power. Built to fight, their mere presence can often avert a conflict.
Come left, steer course 135.
A single one of these ships carries more destructive firepower than half the world's air forces. In the hours before a crisis erupts, a carrier is already on the move, ready to strike at a moment's notice.
We like to think of us as kind of like the president's 911 organization. If he has a challenge somewhere, we can quickly move to that area and provide a presence and hopefully a stabilizing effect on whatever is happening.
Longer than 3 football fields, these massive ships carry the most advanced weapon systems ever built.
We bring with us 50 aircraft that are attack and fighter aircraft for power projection, along with other aircraft in the air wing, normally about 75 to 80 aircraft on our ship.
This carrier and all others of her generation trace their heritage to a ship built at the height of the Cold War. Her design was a radical departure from previous carriers and became the inspiration for a whole new kind of warship. The USS Forrestal was the first of the super carriers. Her mission at sea forced her to carry, deep within her hull, the seeds of her own destruction. July 25th, 1967. The war in Southeast Asia is intensifying, and so is America's commitment. The USS Forrestal, the world's first super carrier, arrives at Yankee Station off the coast of Vietnam. She carries 90 aircraft and 5,000 men. It is her first combat deployment. Within hours of her arrival, she begins flight operations. Surrounded by the ships of her battle group, she was safe from anything in the enemy's arsenal. If you had to be in Vietnam, a carrier off the coast was considered the safest possible assignment. July 28, 1967. Forrestal rendezvous with the rearming ship USS Diamond Head. She takes on 330 tons of ordnance in 2 hours. Some of the crew notice that the bombs they've been given seem old and worn, as if they'd been sitting in the Pentagon's basement since World War II. After the lines are cast off, the ordnance had to be brought to its protective magazines. Tons of munitions are being moved around the ship. July 29th, 1967. Just after dawn, Forrestal's planes take off, heading for their targets in a massive formation known as the Alpha Strike. At 10:25, pilots and crew begin manning their planes for the next mission. They're carrying a heavy load, including the 1,000-pound bombs they'd received the night before. Herb Hope was a pilot assigned to VA-46, the Skyhawk squadron that would be flying the day's mission.
Herb was a very gregarious individual, one who was the air wing operations officer everyone looked up to, and had a lot of fun knowing. He was a real professional on board the ship and a lot of fun to be on liberty with.
Johnny McCain, who was my wingman on that particular hop and also on the only other hop that he and I had flown previous to this one, he went to his airplane and I said, "I'll see you, John." And I walked to mine.
As he ran through his pre-flight routine, McCain had no idea he was sitting on a time bomb.
I was in the captain's chair on the bridge. We had launched the E-2s and our tankers for the strike.
The flight deck is in motion. Pilots run down their pre-flight checklists.
I checked the ordnance, had two A&M 65,000-pound bombs, centerline drop tank with JP in it. Gave the airplane a pre-flight, and then manned up.
I started my airplane, and the airplane started normally, and I began to check the gauges in the aircraft.
Onboard cameras monitor every move as aircraft are brought forward to the bow catapults. Forrestal's Alpha Strike is about to get underway. Suddenly, a bright flash rips across the aft portion of the deck.
I felt this tremendous impact, not an explosion, but an impact that shook my entire airplane very severely.
And I looked forward, and I heard this whoomp, which is very typical of fuel igniting.
A fire has erupted beneath McCain's Park Skyhawk. McCain's fuel tank has split open and is spilling volatile JP-5 jet fuel onto the flight deck.
We immediately sounded GQ as it looked like the fire was going to spread. You sound GQ in order to get all people on their battle stations and let the ship up. Fastest way to do it.
Firefighting teams known as repair aid crews head for their hose stations. Below deck, the ship is reacting quickly. There's no greater nightmare for a sailor than a fire aboard ship. With nowhere to run, he has to rely on training and instinct.
And when the general alarm sounded, I hit the deck and grabbed my shirt and trousers. My room boy burst in the room about that moment. He says, "Commander, Commander, fire, bad fire." So I didn't have my shoes. I kept thinking, well, I thought quickly, maybe I better take my shoes. The decks might get hot.
I was instantly called to the bridge. I ran out without my shirt, jumped in my chair, and from then on, we were dealing with the fire.
The situation is critical. From its flash point beneath John McCain's Skyhawk, the fire is spreading to the other aircraft of his squadron, all fully armed for the coming mission.
And then it got awfully dark. I mean dark. Black smoke all over the place. And I looked at the pilot in the plane next to me, Gary Stark, and his canopy was open. And he had his hands crossed in front of his face, like, what do I do next?
The men of the repair aid are charging their fire hoses toward the growing flames.
And I was the last to see Gary Stark. When the clouds of smoke came in, he disappeared and never to be seen again.
Aviation bosun's mate Gerald Ferrier grabs a fire extinguisher and rushes toward the burning aircraft.
Chief Ferrier was the flight deck chief on the Forrestal, his leader. Everyone who knew him respected him. Everybody looked at him as being very old, and I'm sure he was in his early 30s, and he was old compared to the 18 and 19-year-olds that were the flight deck crew.
Armed only with a carbon dioxide canister and without protective clothing of any kind, Ferrier's only thought is of the pilots trapped in their cockpits. Ferrier is joined by the repair aid. A hose is now washing down the burning Skyhawks, but what's needed is foam, which can blanket the fire, depriving it of oxygen. Water cools the surrounding air, making it harder for vapors to ignite. Water alone poured onto burning jet fuel merely spreads the fire around. Faced with a growing fire, the Skyhawk pilots were thinking about their own survival. The only way to avoid being burned alive was to get out, any way you could.
I shut down the engine of my aircraft and unstrapped, pulled it, and saw that there was fire all around the airplane. The A4 has a nose probe, a refueling probe that sticks out from the nose about 3 feet beyond the nose. And I walked out on the refueling probe and jumped off of the refueling probe and rolled through the fire.
Driven by the wind, the burning fuel is spreading aft.
And I remember thinking to myself, I wonder if this airplane will be AOCP, aircraft out of commission for parts, if I blow the canopy. And that thought lasted about 2 seconds, and I blew that dude, and then I stood up and exited on the starboard side of the airplane.
Clouds of billowing smoke rise into the sky as Captain Beeling and the bridge crew react to the blaze.
The first thing to do was to maneuver the ship so as to reduce the draft on the fire and to position the wind to reduce the the spread of the flames.
An immediate concern is the bomb farm, a stash of ordnance located next to the island. If these bombs are exposed to the flames, they could cook off and destroy the bridge.
We had 150 tons of bombs, rockets, and other assorted fireworks out on the deck.
The ordnance is quickly manhandled over the side and dumped into the sea. Around the fire, water and foam hoses are now operating. 15 men are working close to the planes, while the burning fuel is devouring Skyhawks at will. What they don't know is that McCain's two 1,000-pound bombs have already fallen into the flames. In the heat of the fire, their high explosives have gone critical. 1 minute and 28 seconds into the fire, the first bomb detonates. Half a ton of high explosives release a devastating shockwave. What had been a dangerous fire becomes a scene of unimaginable carnage.
It was incredible. I mean, a 1,000-pound bomb going off not very far from you.
And like a good jarhead, I was down below the flight deck level, and all that shrapnel went over the top.
It knocked me backwards about 10 feet, and I got shrapnel in my legs and in my chest.
I saw an individual sailor picked up and thrown from the area of the fire all the way up to the bow, as if he were a projectile. That was illustrative of what we were in for.
Chief Farrier and the repair aid crew are killed instantly. All that remains are the severed fire hoses flapping wildly. The flight deck is strewn with debris and wounded.
The repair 8 crew was gone. The one man was about midships here on his belly, crawling on his elbows with nothing from the waist down. One of the crewmen coming out of the pack had no left shoulder and arm, where a missile had gone through him.
The devastation above deck is clear. What's not yet known is that the bomb has blown a hole in the armored deck, causing major damage on the O3 level below.
Tons of JP5 was pouring like a fiery waterfall all the way down to the bow of the ship.
A crew berthing area lies just underneath McCain's Skyhawk. The men of Forrestal's night shift are fast asleep. The devastation is total. More than 70 men die in their berths, never knowing what hit them. On deck, the men not killed by the initial blast pick themselves up and run back toward the fire. There are crewmates lying wounded, and the fire has to be brought under control. Explosions have scattered bombs across the deck. 40,000 gallons of jet fuel sit in parked aircraft. If the fire isn't put out, the explosions will tear the Forrestal apart.
So I was going a little faster on all fours, across to the starboard side, when the second bomb went off. And I knew we were in deep kimchi then. We really were.
Another 1,000 pounds of high explosives rip into the hull. Pieces of shrapnel slice through the decks and puncture the Forrestal's hull below the waterline.
One of the explosions tore holes in the bottom of the hull. I think 7 holes, as I remember it.
The shrapnel also hinders the firefighting efforts.
1,000-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs, Shrike missiles, which not only killed the firefighters, but also filled the hoses with shrapnel so that they wouldn't work.
More burning fuel pours into the ship, feeding large fires now raging below decks. Damage control parties struggle to cope with the growing disaster. At every turn, things seem to get worse. For the crew, training and individual courage take over.
I saw the most courageous activity that I've ever seen in my life, and that was young sailors fighting this fire the same way one would fight hand-to-hand combat. Literally sacrificing their lives in the flames in order to save the lives of their shipmates.
A large portion of the flight deck aft has been completely blown away. Each explosion rattles the hull, bringing the crew to their knees. The detonations can be felt aboard the other ships coming to Forrestal's aid.
What you really feel is the concussion. And that was just about knocking some of us off of our feet, and we were 1,000 yards astern to carrier when those bombs were going off.
Those closer to the bombs are tossed around like rag dolls.
I got blown into the catwalk back after the elevators, and I landed on 2 purple shirts, the refueling crew.
The crew surrenders the flight deck to the fire and runs for cover.
The 3 of us went on in and went on down to the hangar bay. And I started forward on the hangar bay, and I looked out of the elevator, this elevator right here behind us, and the Vidgies, one of them just torched, blew vigilante parts out to starboard.
From the bridge, a distress call goes out for assistance with the mass casualties. The message sends a shock through the fleet. Forrestal is in deep trouble. As explosions shake the Forrestal down to her keel, many of her crew have very little idea what's happened.
We all kind of just looked at each other like, because we didn't have any idea what was going on. We didn't know if the Vietnamese had somehow snuck in on the ship and had started attacking us.
And I went into a compartment where there was a television taking pictures of the flight deck. What I saw on that television was my ship blowing up in real time, and I could feel the concussions in the compartment, and it was an eerie feeling of saying, how can this be?
As Herb Hope makes his way below, he finds men unsure of how to react to the growing fire.
There were some people kind of congregating around the sprinkler activating system, and I told them, hey, fire that sucker off right now because we're going to need it. And that turned on the sprinkler system in Hangar Bay 3. And it was a good move.
In the midst of this chaos, Commander Merv Rowland makes certain the firefighters have what they need.
We had full power available. The fire rooms had full boiler pressure available, all 8 on the line. Generators were on the line.
On the flight deck, 2 waves of firefighting parties have been wiped out. Planes have been shredded by the bomb blasts, spilling their fuel and dropping their ordnance into the flames. Within minutes, every ship on Yankee Station is responding to Forrestal's distress signal. On the horizon, a rising column of smoke marks Forrestal's location. The ship was at condition Zebra. All her doors and hatches were sealed, making the ship as watertight as possible. Ideally, condition Zebra would also make it more difficult for a fire to spread. But with the flames blocking escape routes and sealed hatches making movement more difficult, many would find themselves trapped.
There were people trapped by flame and fire that had no way out.
Damage Control Central established fire boundaries, marking a line beyond which the fire would not be allowed to pass. Now the men of Forrestal would stop the fire or lose the ship. For those who were trapped in the smoke, the danger was much more immediate and personal.
Smoke was pouring into the compartment, and we were busy stuffing rags in every crack that we could find in the room to try to keep out the smoke. So we had wet rags across our mouth and nose. Down on the deck, where there was about 3 or 4 inches of relatively fresh air, so we could keep breathing without passing out from smoke inhalation.
Anything was better than staying trapped and waiting for the inevitable. The men decided to take their chances outside the compartment.
The 3 of us left the O1 level, went down the ladder, out into the hangar deck, which was pitch black, full of smoke, and we didn't realize it, but they had already closed the hangar bay doors that separate the hangar bays. Here I was, a 20-year-old kid, and all I was hoping was I didn't screw something up and get these 2 guys killed.
Blinded by the smoke, the 3 sailors were going nowhere. They managed to feel their way back to their station.
Got back in the radar room, back down on the deck again, trying to breathe what we could. Didn't know whether it was going to be our last breath or not. But I know the 3 of us said a prayer.
As the Forrestal struggles to survive, her destroyer escorts race to her rescue. Deck log, USS Rupertus. At 10:55, high-order detonations on deck of Forrestal in midst of Class Bravo fire. Observed pieces of equipment, planes, an unknown number of personnel blown overboard by detonation. Forrestal appears to be dead in the water.
Our captain was talking to the carrier skipper. Basically, what he wanted us to do was come up along the port quarter of the carrier where his firefighting teams couldn't reach because that whole place was engulfed in flames, and he wanted us to get our fire hoses on parts of the ship that his own people couldn't get water on.
As the destroyers close in, time and air are running out for Crutchley and his men.
So Ron Grayson, Joe Laban, and myself popped open the hatch, and it was quite a moment when the three of us were able to breathe fresh air again.
On the bridge, Captain Beeling gives the order for all damaged planes to be shoved over the side so that their fuel won't add to the fire.
They were rolling bombs off the flight deck right in front of us. They were pushing burning aircraft off in the water right in front of us. And the captain was having to drive the ship out around that and then back in next to the Forrestal.
The Rupertus struggles to get its hoses on the flight deck. The destroyer's crew can see the men trapped on the sponsons with explosions going off overhead.
Joe and I, we were hanging off the side of the ship when a Phantom, the tail end, had finally just had it, and it fell, and it missed us by maybe a foot.
The three sailors are at the very edge, staring at the 70-foot drop to the water below.
We went over to the side because we were seriously contemplating abandoning ship, whether somebody told us to or not. And that was just about the time one of the destroyers pulled up alongside and wanted to know if we were going to jump. And we'd been around just enough to know that you don't jump between a destroyer and an aircraft carrier and not get sucked into somebody's screws.
With destroyers on either side of her, it was essential that Forrestal maintain a steady course.
I got word from port steering aft that the 3 people manning that station were mangled badly.
If the carrier loses steering, she could crush the smaller Rupertus or Mackenzie.
You see, your steering system in this ship is electrical hydraulic. And the big hydraulic cylinders that turn the rudders are down in after steering.
With the Forrestal headed for another crisis, her crew struggles to find whatever shelter they can. Still trapped on the starboard sponson, Crutchley and his men are looking for a way out.
Got to looking around a little bit and noticed that the control arm for the crane ran from where the hook area was at about a 45-degree angle straight to the flight deck. Joe and Ron, I said, well, you going up the control arm that's holding onto the control cables on either side of it, and we'll try to get the hell out of here that way.
Climbing onto the crane, the 3 sailors ease their way up to the flight deck. With explosions going off all around them, they run for the safety of the island.
And I guess we made it about halfway to the island when we heard another explosion. We turned around, and one of the, I guess probably the last remaining belly tanks finally blew, and it covered the crane and the gun sponson with burning jet plane fuel.
The 3 sailors are safe, but for the men in port steering, the ordeal's just begun.
As I talked to them, they told me they had put tourniquets. But one, I think, had an arm missing. The other one had a leg missing.
Roland knows the situation's grim. His eyes scan the plotting board. The men in port steering are surrounded on all sides by fire.
Kind of emotional when I think of these things because it's hard to sit and know someone's dying and there's no possible way that I or anyone else could get to them. But they stayed alive for several hours. I can't remember how many. They stayed alive long enough to shift the power for steering from the port steering engine to the starboard, which was completely undamaged.
Sailors to the end, the 3 men stood fast and did their duty.
I never heard a whimper or a whine out of any of them. They stayed there and did their job without any belly aching or complaining, and they passed away. That's it. I still get a little torn up when I think about it. It was hard to know that there was somebody there you could not come to their aid in any way, shape, or fashion.
By now, everyone on board knew somebody amongst the injured and the dying.
I walked into the sick bay, and I saw a number of people lying on beds and cots with their skin burned completely off. And I turned and I started to leave, and a voice called me, said, Mr. McCain. And I walked over, and he gave his name to me, and he was one of the plane captains in my squadron, and he said, asked if one of the other pilots had made it. I said, yes, he made it, he's fine. He said, thank God, and he died. And others were dying there. There just wasn't anything they could do for them because they were so badly burned.
The fire rules the flight deck. If Forrestal is to be saved, her flight deck will have to be retaken inch by inch. Fire hoses have been shredded by shrapnel and lie burning on the deck. New hoses are brought into action, along with the vital foam hoses. Unfortunately, with many of the trained firefighters killed, the volunteers were making some critical mistakes. Occasionally, foam and water hoses were used in tandem. The result, the water washed away the foam, and the fire continued unabated. For these volunteers, a crash course in firefighting in a sheltered area was their only real training before charging toward the flames. In the midst of the crisis, they learned quickly. Despite the heat and the danger, they pressed ahead, manhandling airplanes and laying down foam.
Once you smell hot foam on a flight deck, you'll never forget the smell. And it became necessary to move an aircraft. And we were on either side pushing and pushing and pushing and slipping and sliding, and it was an exercise. It was not an easy thing to do. And I noticed next to me a sailor just walking along, and he obviously wasn't straining at all. He wasn't doing anything to show that he was exerting himself. And I felt I better look at this fellow and find out why he's not helping us push. As I looked over, I saw that he had his finger in a hole in the fuel tank to prevent the fuel from coming out on the deck, and I decided that probably he was doing a very good job.
Forrestal had endured 9 major detonations and countless smaller ones. But the danger was far from over. The ship carried tons of ordnance, and it was all vulnerable to the heat. Worse yet, the fire was now invading the hangar deck. Pilots, air crews, just about anybody who could carry a hose lent a hand. A mad rush ensued to shove ordnance over the side before the fire reached it.
So we went on back hangar bay 3, which is the back end of the ship, you say, and started pulling all kind of ammunition, ordnance, rockets, and bombs, and I was throwing them over the side. The less we had to blow up, the better it was.
Choking black smoke had pushed men onto thin ledges of shelter. From these scattered positions, they'll launch their final assault with more hoses, more water, more foam. They exert their last remaining strength to bring the fire under control.
You have to fight it, and you're not only fighting it for your shipmates, but for yourself.
You either put the fire out, or you go down with the ship.
From multiple angles of attack, water pours into Forrestal's charred compartments. As the Forrestal limps along, the carrier Oriskany comes alongside to offload needed supplies. As she does, another crisis is about to erupt in Hangar Bay 3, where Forrestal's liquid oxygen plant lies directly in the path of the flames. By some miracle, the bombs exploding on the flight deck had missed the O2 room by inches, fore and aft.
At that particular time, this plant was under full production, and it had a 2,000-gallon tank full of liquid oxygen. One bomb blew and went down 4 decks past the hangar deck, and it wasn't 20 feet forward of this plant. The other bomb it blew the big hole was about 15 feet after the plant. If either one of those had been that much difference, we'd had the world's biggest cutting torch.
The flames reach liquid oxygen. The aft portion of the ship could explode like a supernova.
And I had one of my men was out there, and he told me, he says, I'm out here, I can't get in, what'll I do? And I said, dump the oxygen. But he showed a lot of courage in staying there, and he was calm, he was cool. He says, Commander, if it gets any hotter, what'll I do? I said, put your life jacket on and go swimming.
On the flight deck, progress was finally being made. A protective blanket of foam had been laid down between the fire and the island. In some places, white smoke, a sign the fire was going out, could be seen. But the flight deck is still a killing zone. More missiles are going off, Sidewinders, Zunis, and the deadly anti-radar Shrike.
Some of the missiles were designed to destroy enemy radars, and they had fragmentation warheads. And so they scattered those warhead fragments all through the upper part of the ship, including the fire hoses.
Below deck, the Forrestal has become a maze of smoke-filled corridors.
Men of Forrestal, this is the captain. We have got some uncontrolled fires, which at the moment are getting worse.
The rapidly moving fire seems to be conspiring to cut men off, then slowly suffocate them with smoke and toxic gases. Rescue parties trying to make their way around the gallery deck found their efforts hampered by the astronomically high temperatures of the fire. At 11:52, the fire on the flight deck was reported to be under control, and helicopters from the Oriskany and Bonhomme Richard were able to land and evacuate the most seriously wounded. They also delivered much-needed foam and firefighting gear.
Men of Forrestal, this is the captain. I want to let you know that Forrestal is again making 25 knots. We are going to rendezvous just before dusk with the USS Repose to get our hurt people off.
The fire still had a strong grip on the heart of the ship. From the moment the first bomb exploded, fires had been feeding on just about anything that would burn. Every turn introduced a new danger. In yet another cruel twist, hoses spraying salt water mixed with spilled battery acid to create a cloud of toxic chlorine gas. Merv Rowland got on the 1MC and ordered the crew to stay clear of the affected areas.
There's suspected chlorine gas in compartment 03. Stay forward of frame 210. We don't want to have to carry out any more people who went up to help and passed out. Chlorine gas is deadly, and it is up there.
If the Forrestal was to be saved, the crew would have to rely on its training, courage, and nerve. Each hatch that opened revealed a raging furnace behind it. At the extreme temperature of the fire, everything burned. The only way of cooling the ship down was water, and the only way to extinguish the flames was foam. Hoses were dragged from one compartment to the next as the ship was slowly reclaimed by the crew. As huge amounts of water were pumped into the ship to fight the fires, Forrestal began listing to port. Bilge pumps worked overtime to bring her back to level. The battle dragged on. As they beat back the flames, Forrestal's crewmen made some gruesome discoveries. Men trapped below had suffocated in the thick smoke or been burned alive by the fuel.
I guess initially everybody thought that there couldn't be anything worse than the fire itself. Well, we found out that was totally wrong. The worst thing about it was trying to go back into the burnout areas later on and finding your dead and burnt shipmates and trying to get their bodies removed from that part of the ship and try to maintain the dignity of your fallen comrades. And that was hard to do in some cases because and some of the bodies were, more or less frozen in place from being burnt and charred, and their arms might have been out like this, and it was kind of heartbreaking in a way because you couldn't get them through passageways every place you tried to get them out of that area end of the ship. So you'd have to try to, as delicately as you could, bring in the arms or whatever so you could bring them out of that area of the ship. But that was hard. The smell of burnt flesh is, if you've ever smelled it, it's something that never goes away. It's stays with you.
We laid the blanket down on the deck and put this fellow in the blanket, and he was burnt beyond recognition. There's no telling his nationality, his heritage, or anything. All he had on was his boots.
As the flames were finally extinguished, the luckiest men were those who, despite the odds, despite their ordeal, were still alive.
On those days after the fire and then the minutes after the fire, there was a closeness that only a sailor can understand. We were still alive. We were still afloat. We'd done our job. We did our captain proud, and he does us proud. And we just relaxed in such a way that I've never relaxed before. It was a feeling of we've done it, and things were okay. We were so tired, it was almost hard to sleep, but we slept immediately.
As the crew caught its breath and found a moment to reflect, Captain Beeling read a prayer over the ship's announcement system.
Captain Beeling offered a prayer, and I'm sure that I wasn't the only one that just lost it. We just cried. There was no way not to.
Men of Forrestal, this is the captain. There are no words that say what comes from our hearts tonight, and yet we must try. I ask you to join with me in this humble effort to express our thanks and our deep, deep debt to Almighty God. Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we see this day as 1 minute and yet a lifetime for all of us. We thank you for the courage of those who gave their lives in saving their shipmates today. We humbly ask you to grant them peace, and to their loved ones the consolation and strength to bear their loss. Help us to renew the faith we have in you. We thank you for our own lives. May we remember you as you have remembered us today. From our hearts we turn to you now, knowing that you have been at our sides in every minute of this day. Heavenly Father, help us to rebuild and to reman our ship so that our brothers who died today may not have made a fruitless sacrifice.
With the bodies of the dead assembled in one final formation, the crew gathered in the hangar bay for a memorial service.
I think that everybody had a terrible feeling of loss. If you can picture that hangar bay, the chaplain standing over 134 body bags, you know it was a bad day.
Forrestal's crew remembered their dead, but the questions soon began. Camera footage was examined in minute detail, and personal testimony was taken for the record.
It occurred when a Zuni rocket, which is a 5-inch powerful air-to-ground rocket, accidentally fired from one of the fighter planes.
The jets on the flight deck started their engines with an electric generator mounted on a cart, then switched over to internal power.
The pilot of the aircraft across from mine hit the switch and got an enormous shot of stray voltage that leaped and fired, ignited the rocket.
Forrestal's ordeal had started with a single faulty circuit. Cameras caught this tiny reflection of a Zuni rocket launching across the deck.
I saw the missile fire from the F-4 on the starboard quarter go across the flight deck and hit the underneath side of the A-4, knocking off its belly tank and knocking the bomb off.
What might have remained a bad fire was made infinitely worse by the early cook-off of the 1,000-pound bombs Forrestal had received from her rearming ship the night before.
The
first bomb, as I've mentioned, went off in 1 minute and 28 seconds. And the reason for that was it was a World War II bomb that we had been required to carry for economic reasons. It was ancient, it was thin-skinned, and susceptible to early cook-off.
The Forrestal fire would forever change the Navy. Today, at the Navy's firefighting school in Norfolk, the emphasis is on preparation. Every sailor who puts to sea receives instruction in fighting fires. If every Marine is a rifleman, every sailor is a firefighter.
As a result of the Forrestal fire, everybody that comes aboard as part of the crew, as part of the air wing, bark staff, all has firefighting training.
In the last 30 years, we've made improvements on ordnance and ordnance safety systems. We've added thermal protection to a lot of the large bombs. This allows us to not only cool the weapon, but gives us a chance to get in there and fight the fire, get the weapon out of the fire prior to the explosives actually detonating.
The priorities of the flight deck personnel who are fighting the fire is obviously to get the pilots out of the aircraft, and they're driving towards that. And then other crews are actually getting water and cooling agents onto the weapons themselves.
Every time we go to sea, we do one of these. About once a month, we do a mass casualty drill. We're constantly drilling, working on parts of it, and trying to perfect it. It's the training that we do today that's going to determine whether we function properly when it happens.
We feel now in today's Navy, we are much better trained, and particularly the second, third, and fourth echelon of people are all trained so that they could come in and assist if for some reason the highly trained people that we have on the flight deck should have a problem and be unable to put the fire out.
Catastrophes like Forrestal will just not happen again.
Everyone on board became a man that day.
I was amazed at the heroism, how every man, there wasn't a kid on there.
The whole thing kind of drew everybody together as not just a crew, but a family.
For many, it was the last moment. For others, it was a very defining moment.
But I don't think you could fault a single person on that crew for not giving everything that they had. And of course, a lot of guys gave their life, and you can't give any more than that.
Everybody had one common goal, and that was to save that ship. A fire at sea, you can't go across the street. You gotta stay there. You gotta fight it yourself. And it was amazing, the cooperation that everybody put together to keep this ship afloat, and so we could fight it. We could fight this ship again the next couple of days if we had to.
2 September 1967, at sea, en route Norfolk. To my loved ones, so we are now on the way home, having waged our war, one which we probably do not understand very well, for 4.5 days. I think I can safely say that there were no cowards. Men afraid, but no cowards. Every man did his job. Many did much more. We had a big job to do. We had worked and trained long and hard, and we were prepared to do that job. I can't help but having a keen sense of disappointment. Suppose that the best thing that we could do now is to fix her up and to go back and try again. We're on the way to Norfolk, where on about the 19th of September, we will commence a period in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, which will last anywhere from 6 months to a year. They are going to mend our wounds, modernize us some, and then we'll train up for another go at it. I called Caroline from Subic Bay as soon as I could, something like 4 o'clock in the morning, my time. Letters from Caroline indicate they have had a very busy summer. They are all healthy and happy. Much swimming and camping and visiting and traveling and playing. Survival takes on an entirely new dimension with such a wife and family, leading the list of my many blessings. I am very glad to be going back home to Caroline and Jamie and Leslie and Clifton and John. I love you. Peace. Clark.
next week.
I'm a robot. We robots make your cars, defuse your bombs, clean up your nuclear waste. Now you make us more and more like you. Your work here is done.